For years, the safest assumption about Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks was that whatever remained between them belonged to the past. Not forgotten exactly. You don't forget 50 years of songs, arguments, stages, hotel rooms, breakups, reunions, and all those lyrics that sounded suspiciously like private conversations set to music. But finished. That was the assumption. And now, at 76, Lindsey Buckingham has said something surprisingly simple that makes that assumption much harder to hold on to. He and Stevie are talking again, not occasionally, not through managers, not merely exchanging polite messages because another anniversary has arrived. According to Lindsey, they are talking all the time. That phrase is doing more work than it first appears, because these aren't two musicians who simply lost touch. For Lindsey and Stevie, silence has always meant something. So has conversation, and I think that distinction matters. The obvious question is whether this means they are somehow back together. Romantically, no evidence supports that, and turning this into an old love rekindled fantasy would actually make the story less interesting. What has happened is stranger than that. Stevie Nicks is back in Lindsey Buckingham's life after a period when their relationship appeared damaged almost beyond repair, and he seems genuinely comfortable saying so. Think about where they were only a few years ago. In 2018, Lindsey was removed from Fleetwood Mac following a bitter internal dispute. What followed was not one of those carefully managed rock band separations where everyone wishes everyone else well and quietly moves on. There were accusations, different versions of what had happened, old tensions resurfaced. Stevie later described the situation surrounding Lindsey's departure in stark terms, while Lindsey publicly placed much of the blame for his firing on her. For people who had already survived one of rock music's most famous breakups, somehow they had found another ending, or so it seemed. That's the part worth remembering now. Because when Lindsey talks about Stevie today, he isn't talking like a man rehearsing the old argument. He describes something being worked through. He points to the upcoming Fleetwood Mac documentary as part of what he calls a healing process, not merely between himself and Stevie, but among surviving members of the band. And documentaries can do that. They make people sit in rooms and answer questions they've spent years avoiding. They put an old photograph in front of you, an old recording, someone who is no longer there. Then suddenly the version of the past you have carried for 8 years doesn't feel quite as simple. Christine McVie's death in 2022 changed the emotional landscape around Fleetwood Mac as well. Lindsey and Stevie were both part of a history that was becoming increasingly impossible to revisit, with everyone still present. Perhaps age does that too. You reach a point where winning an old argument becomes less important than understanding why you were still having it, and there had already been clues. In 2025, Lindsey and Stevie finally returned together to Buckingham Nicks, the obscure 1973 album they made before Fleetwood Mac transformed their lives. They remastered and reissued it, reopening a chapter that belonged to them before rumors, before fame, and before their relationship became public mythology. Most people saw nostalgia. Maybe it was, but looking at it now, it also feels like something else. A door opening very quietly, because Lindsey Buckingham isn't merely revisiting Stevie Nicks in old photographs anymore. She is somehow back in the conversation, and perhaps the more interesting question isn't why they started talking again. It's why, after everything, neither of them was quite ready to let the conversation end. There is a temptation to turn Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks into a simple story. Two young musicians fall in love. They become famous. Fame destroys the relationship. They spend decades circling each other. Eventually, age softens everything. It is neat, too neat, because their relationship was never really defined by one breakup. It was defined by the fact that the breakup never stopped being useful, painful, creative, and strangely public. That is what made Fleetwood Mac different. Most couples separate and try not to see each other again. Lindsey and Stevie separated, and then had to sing the separation to each other under stage lights, night after night, year after year. That changes the meaning of resentment. It also changes the meaning of forgiveness. Take Go Your Own Way. For millions of listeners, it became one of Fleetwood Mac's defining songs. Energetic, immediate, almost liberating. But Stevie heard something else in it. She objected to the line, suggesting she was packing up and shacking up because she felt it falsely portrayed what she had done after their breakup. Lindsey kept the lyric. That detail is often treated like colorful rock history. I don't think it is. I think it explains far more than people realize. Imagine being forced to perform someone else's version of your own breakup for decades, and imagine being the person who wrote that version. Then standing a few feet away while the subject of the song sings harmonies around it. That is not ordinary emotional distance. It is intimacy turned into ritual, and Stevie answered in her own way. Silver Springs, the song famously left off rumors, became almost a counterstatement. Years later, when Fleetwood Mac performed it during the dance, there was a moment between Stevie and Lindsey that fans still revisit obsessively. She stared directly at him while singing words that had been written out of heartbreak years earlier. He looked back. Nothing dramatic happened. No embrace, no public confession, just eye contact. But sometimes that is enough. If you have ever watched that performance, you know why people still talk about it. The strange thing is that Fleetwood Mac made emotional ambiguity profitable. The audience was never quite sure where Lindsey ended and the songs began, or where Stevie's anger became performance. Perhaps they weren't sure either. That may be why the current reconciliation matters more than a normal celebrity reunion. They are not simply repairing a friendship. They are revisiting a story that has been interpreted by millions of strangers for half a century. And here is the part that gets overlooked. Lindsey and Stevie have often disagreed not only about what happened, but about what those events meant. That is a much harder conflict to repair. Facts can be negotiated, meaning is personal. In later interviews, Stevie described the atmosphere surrounding Lindsey's 2018 departure in terms that suggested she had reached a final limit. Lindsey, meanwhile, repeatedly argued that his removal reflected tensions involving Stevie and the internal politics of the band. Both versions existed publicly. Fans chose sides. Some blamed Stevie, others blamed Lindsey. Fleetwood Mac itself became part courtroom, part mythology. Then Christine McVie died, and suddenly the argument was taking place inside a shrinking room. That changes things. When someone who shared the entire history disappears, old grievances lose some of their permanence. You start noticing something uncomfortable. There may not be unlimited time to remain angry. Lindsey's recent comments suggest that the documentary process forced the surviving members to revisit old material together and reconsider parts of their history. He described the experience as healing. That word matters. Not resolved and not forgotten. Healing. Those are very different things. Healing suggests that the wound was real. It also suggests that the wound is still visible. And maybe that is why Stevie being back in Lindsey's life feels so unusual. Nothing about their history suggests that they suddenly discovered they had misunderstood everything. More likely, they finally reached a point where understanding everything was no longer required. Sometimes people return to each other, not because the past has changed, but because the future has become shorter. And for Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks, that may be the most honest explanation of all. The strangest part of Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks talking again is not that they found a way back to each other. It is that they seem to be doing it without pretending the past was simpler than it was. That distinction matters, because reconciliation stories are usually cleaned up for public consumption. Someone says time healed everything. Someone else says they always cared. The rough edges disappear. But Lindsey and Stevie do not really have that luxury. Too much is documented. Too many interviews exist. Too many songs contradict the polite version. And maybe that is why this new chapter feels more believable. They are not returning to innocence. There is no innocence left to return to. What they have instead is memory. Shared memory. And memory becomes a very different thing when almost everyone who helped create it is getting older. Lindsey recently suggested that the process surrounding the Fleetwood Mac documentary brought people back into contact and forced old emotions into the same room again. He described that process as healing. That word keeps appearing because it does something reunion cannot. A reunion is an event. Healing is a process. One can happen in a night. The other usually requires admitting that something actually hurt. And there is another layer here that deserves more attention. For decades, fans have wanted Lindsey and Stevie to represent something larger than themselves. The great, unfinished romance. The couple who should have worked. The two people who somehow belonged together even when they clearly could not live peacefully together. You still see that idea everywhere. Old performance clips, comments under Silver Springs, photographs from the 70s. People watch them looking at each other on stage and project an ending onto two people who never asked the audience to write one for them. I understand why. Their story invites it. But I think the romantic interpretation can actually hide the more interesting truth. Maybe Stevie is back in Lindsey's life because, at this stage, romance is no longer the question. Maybe companionship is. Recognition. Someone who remembers the same rooms, the same failures, the same impossible rise. Think about how few people alive can truly understand what happened to them. Not just Fleetwood Mac becoming famous. That is the easy part. Who understands what it was like to arrive as a couple, break apart while making one of the most successful albums in history, then spend decades watching strangers interpret the breakup. Very few people. Stevie understands Lindsey's life in a way almost nobody else can. And Lindsey understands hers. That does not automatically make them compatible. It makes them witnesses. There is a difference. That may be what age changes. When you are 30, the person who knows your history can feel like the person trapping you inside it. At 76, that same person may become one of the only people left who remembers who you were before everyone else had an opinion. And there is something quietly emotional about that, because before Fleetwood Mac, before stadiums, before rumors, there was Buckingham Nicks. Two young people trying to make music together. No mythology yet, no camps, no documentaries explaining what happened. Just Lindsey and Stevie. The recent reissue of that album was treated mostly as an archival event, but in retrospect it feels almost symbolic. They went back to the beginning before publicly acknowledging that they had found their way back into regular conversation. Maybe those things are unrelated, maybe not. I tend to think artists reveal themselves through the projects they choose to revisit. And Lindsey and Stevie chose to revisit the moment before everything became complicated. That does not mean they want to become those people again. They cannot. But perhaps they wanted to remember that those people existed. There is another uncomfortable truth here. Reconciliation becomes easier when there is less future available for another rupture. At some point, you stop asking whether someone deserves forgiveness in the abstract. You begin asking whether you really want the last chapter between you to remain unfinished. That is a different question. And Lindsey's recent tone suggests something has shifted, not dramatically. That is what makes it interesting. There has been no grand announcement, no staged embrace, no claim that everything is fixed, just conversation, frequent conversation, after years in which even that seemed unlikely. For two people whose relationship was once loud enough to fill arenas, perhaps the most meaningful development is happening somewhere much quieter now. A phone call, a memory, a sentence that does not turn into an argument. And after everything they have survived together and apart, that may be more significant than any reunion fans could imagine. There is one detail in Lindsey Buckingham's recent comments that may matter more than the obvious headline. He did not speak as if Stevie Nicks had suddenly returned after disappearing completely. He spoke as if a door that had been difficult to open was now staying open. That is subtler, and probably more important, because people often imagine reconciliation as one dramatic moment, a phone call, an apology, a reunion. Real reconciliation is usually much less cinematic. It is repetition, talking again, then talking again after that, discovering that the next conversation does not collapse under the weight of the last one. For Lindsey and Stevie, that may be the actual breakthrough. Their history trained everyone to expect fireworks. Fleetwood Mac practically taught audiences to interpret every glance, every lyric, every silence. But maybe the story now is that there are no fireworks. Just two people in their 70s, finally communicating without needing the old conflict to define the exchange. And I think fans should notice that, because there is still enormous temptation to ask whether this means another Fleetwood Mac chapter, another performance, another public reunion. Perhaps. Lindsey has hinted that the future may still contain surprises, but that is not the part I would rush toward. The more revealing development is already here. Stevie is part of his life again, not as a memory trapped inside rumors, not merely as the woman standing across the stage in an old viral clip, as someone he speaks to now. After everything that happened, that simplicity feels almost radical, and maybe this is where the story changes meaning. For decades, people asked whether Lindsey and Stevie would ever get back together. The better question now may be whether they finally stopped needing to. Maybe that is why this moment feels different from almost every other Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks headline that came before it. There is no explosive reunion, no dramatic confession under stage lights, no carefully staged photograph designed to tell fans that everything has been repaired, and perhaps that is exactly why this matters. For most of their lives, Lindsey and Stevie were surrounded by noise. Their songs became arguments, their arguments became interviews, their interviews became mythology. Even the years when they barely seemed to speak became part of the story people told about them. Now the most meaningful development may be something almost ordinary. They talk, frequently, and after 50 years of complicated history, ordinary can become extraordinary. I keep coming back to that because it changes the way this entire story looks. Stevie is not back because the past disappeared. She is back because the past no longer seems to have the power to stop every new conversation before it begins. That is a very different kind of return. When people are younger, reconciliation often feels like a courtroom. Someone has to be right. Someone has to admit they were wrong. An apology has to be large enough. A wound has to be explained properly. A version of events has to win. Lindsey and Stevie spent decades living inside competing versions of the same history. Fans chose sides. Biographies chose sides. Interviews created new arguments about old arguments. Even individual songs were treated like evidence. Go Your Own Way, Silver Springs, Dreams. Every lyric became another exhibit in a trial that never really ended. But age does something strange to the need for verdicts. Not because the pain becomes imaginary. It does not. Not because everything is forgiven automatically. It is not. But eventually another question begins to matter more. How much time do you really want to spend defending the same emotional territory? That question becomes difficult to ignore when the people who shared the story begin disappearing. Christine McVie's death changed Fleetwood Mac forever, and I suspect it changed the surviving members in ways that cannot be measured by public statements. When someone who stood beside you through decades of success, chaos, resentment, reunion, and repetition is suddenly gone, the old conflicts start looking different. Not necessarily smaller, different. You realize that history is not permanent simply because it feels permanent. The people carrying it are not permanent either. That may be one reason Lindsey's recent language feels so revealing. He did not talk about defeating Stevie's version of the past. He talked about healing. That word is quieter. It does not require anyone to erase what happened. Healing does not mean the scar disappears. It means the scar stops deciding what happens next. And perhaps that is where Lindsey and Stevie finally are. There is another thing people rarely acknowledge. Their relationship became public property long before either of them could control what that meant. Millions of people have watched clips of them looking at each other. Millions have tried to decide whether those looks meant anger, longing, regret, love, resentment, or some mixture nobody else could understand. Imagine carrying that. Imagine having one of the most complicated relationships of your life repeatedly reduced to a 5-second concert clip, or a lyric, or a photograph. At some point, you might stop wanting to explain yourself entirely. Maybe that is what happened for years, and maybe the fact that they are talking again means explanation is no longer the goal. Recognition is. There are very few people alive who can truly understand what happened to Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks. Not because their lives were uniquely tragic, but because their rise was so strange. They entered Fleetwood Mac together. They broke apart while making music that would define an era. Then they spent decades performing the emotional consequences of that breakup in front of people who had turned those consequences into favorite songs. That is not normal life. And the older they get, the more valuable the other person may become simply as a witness, someone who remembers the cheap apartments, someone who remembers the uncertainty before fame, someone who remembers Buckingham Nicks before anyone cared, someone who can say, "I was there before the mythology." That may be the deepest reason Stevie being back in Lindsey's life matters. Not because it proves they were always meant to end up together. That interpretation is too easy, and frankly it reduces them. Maybe they were never meant to end up anywhere neatly. Maybe their relationship was always going to resist closure. What they seem to have now is something less dramatic and possibly more mature. Contact without possession, history without constant warfare, affection without needing to define it for everyone else, and perhaps finally a little peace. There will still be speculation. Of course there will. Could they appear together again? Could the Fleetwood Mac documentary lead to something else? Could there be another performance, another project, another surprise? Those questions are natural. Lindsey himself has suggested that the future may still contain things people do not expect, but I would be careful not to rush toward that. Because doing so risks missing the more interesting event that has already happened. They found a way to speak again. That sounds small until you remember who they are. For Lindsey and Stevie, communication has never been small. Their entire legacy was built from things they could not say privately and somehow managed to sing publicly. Now, decades later, perhaps the most important words are the ones nobody else gets to hear. A phone call, a memory, a joke only the other person understands, a conversation that starts with Fleetwood Mac and ends somewhere completely ordinary. There is something almost beautiful about that, not because it repairs the past. The past does not need repairing to have value, but because it suggests they finally stop demanding that the past explain everything. And maybe that is what Lindsey Buckingham is really revealing at 76. Stevie Nicks is not back in his life because history pulled them backward. She may be back because for the first time in a very long time, they are capable of moving forward without pretending that history never happened. After everything, there was still a door open and somehow neither of them closed it thereof.